I'm interested in what you have to say also, and I'm hoping we can have a dialogue. I've prepared a PowerPoint. Kim is going to be monitoring the chat. It will be way too confusing for me to try to look at the chat and the question and answer and my script and that. So Kim is going to be monitoring that. But please, if you have a question, please feel free to ask, and I'll do what I can to answer, or maybe open it up to the group to see if other people have the answer. And another piece of my story that some of you have heard before is that I became passionate about voting when I was in high school. I feel very honored that as luck would have it, I turned 18 in April of 1972, making me able to vote in the California primary as the first group of 18-year-olds. And then I voted in the federal election in November, again, as the first group of 18-year-olds to vote. And at that time, I just made a pledge to myself that I would always vote. I had watched with interest the granting of the vote to 18-year-olds, and I was very, very thrilled. So that's a little bit about my background in terms of voting. So this year we are celebrating, as I think you all know, the 100-year anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution. And today I'm going to take you on a chronological trip through the struggles that led to that important milestone in our democracy. I feel confident that many of you are fairly familiar with this history. Still, I hope I will introduce you to a few people or events that might be new to you. There is so much information out there now about the 19th Amendment and the almost the 75-year struggle to bring it about. And there's so many great stories that I'm not going to be able to do more than just scratch the surface. But I think it's always important to be mindful of whose story is not being told, whose narrative is missing. So in truth, the more complete our American story is, the better we can understand who we are as a nation. I urge you to do some digging on your own about the history of suffrage in our United States. And given that, I want to make a little plug in particular. If you didn't see it, I urge you to watch the recently released PBS documentary, The Vote, parts 1 and parts 2, 2 hours for each part, 4 hours total. And it is available through American Experience. You can watch it on your computer. It is really outstanding and super, super interesting. So the other thing I want to say about this material is it's so fun looking at all the images that abound about the women's suffrage movement. It was hard to pick. So I urge you to go into Library of Congress and a number of the other sites that are chronicling important events of this struggle, because the images are fantastic. So anyway, let's begin. The women's suffrage movement was a decades-long fight to win the right to vote for women in the United States. It took activists and reformers nearly 100 years to win that right, and the campaign was not smooth and it was not easy. Disagreements over strategy and what women to include threatened to cripple the movement more than once. But on August 18th, 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was finally ratified, enfranchising most American women and declaring for the first time that they, like men, deserve all the rights and responsibilities of US citizenship. And so before we dig in, I want to clarify some terms. The terms suffrage, political franchise, or simply franchise are all defined as the right to vote in public political elections. During the women's suffrage movement in the United States, suffragists were anyone, female or male, who supported extending the right to vote or suffrage to women. There were also women who were called suffragettes. The term suffragette originated in Great Britain, basically to mock women fighting for the right to vote. Women in Britain were struggling for the right to vote at the same time as those in the United States. However, some women in Britain embraced the term as a way of appropriating it from its pejorative use, and they were proud to call themselves suffragettes. This was less true in the United States, where the term suffragette was often seen as offensive or derogatory. It was used to describe those who embraced more militant tactics rather than the more passive suffragists who relied on education and petitioning government officials. Today, however, many use the term with pride to describe the unruly women, like the National Women's Party founders Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, who marched, picketed, and protested, were arrested, and went on hunger strikes to fight for their right to vote. Any questions? Okay. Oh, for heaven's sakes. Okay, so we need to start at the beginning. In colonial America, the right to vote was generally given to property-owning white male adults who were considered to have a stake in society. At the time of the American Revolution, each state drafted its own constitution. While the country won its independence, ultimately, women did not. Most states incorporated language that excluded women from having the right to vote. Various phrases were used, enfranchising free men, free white men, male person, and man. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 placed voting qualifications in the hands of each state. Though not given the right to vote and denied other basic rights like the right to own property, many American women were still active participants in their communities outside the domestic sphere. In particular, many women joined anti-slavery abolitionist organizations around the country. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is certainly one example. That's a picture of Elizabeth on the left. May not be one you've seen before because it shows her, usually we see her in older photos, but here she is as a younger woman and mom. In 1840, she and her husband attended the Anti-Slavery Convention in London. There, literally in the background, because women were not allowed to speak or be seated on the main floor. So there, literally in the background, Elizabeth met another American woman, Lucretia Mott, and the two formed a new resolve. They decided that they needed to hold a women's rights convention in the United States. Back in the US, other women around the country were forming female societies dedicated at this time to the abolition of slavery. Harriet Forten Purvis was an African-American abolitionist and first-generation suffragist. With her mother and sisters, she formed the first biracial abolitionist group, the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, in 1833. She hosted anti-slavery events at her home, and with her husband, Robert Purvis, actually ran an underground railroad station. She and her sister, Margaretta Forten, were delegates to the first anti-slavery convention of American women in New York City. At this convention, held on May 9th through 12th in 1837, 175 women from 10 different states and representing 20 female anti-slavery groups gathered in New York City to discuss their role in the American abolition movement. This gathering represented the first time that women from such a broad geographic area met with a common purpose of promoting anti-slavery cause among women. Mary S. Parker was the president of the gathering. Other prominent women who were present went on to be vocal members of the women's suffrage movement, including Lucretia Mott, the Grimke sisters, and Lydia Maria Child. The attendees included women of color, the wives and daughters of slaveholders, and women of low economic status. Scholars have described the Anti-Slavery Convention of American Women as the first convention at which women discussed women's rights, especially the rights of African-American women. Many believe it directly influenced the proceedings which followed in 1848 at the Seneca Falls Convention. So now we fast forward 10 years. Inspired by the 1837 Anti-Slavery Convention of American Women and their subsequent meeting in London, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott decided it was time for a women's rights convention in Stanton's hometown of Seneca Falls, New York. On July 19 and 20, 1848, between 200 and 300 people attended the first Women's Rights Convention at the Wesleyan Methodist Chapel in Seneca Falls. The convention had been organized by Stanton and Mott with the help from Mary McClintock, Martha Coffin Wright, Lucretia Mott's sister, and Jane Hunt. And just as a little side note, 3 of these 5 women were members of the Quaker community. On day one, the Declaration of Sentiments was presented, written by Stanton and modeled very closely on the Declaration of Independence. It declared that, quote, all women and men are created, the other way around, all men and women are created equal. It went on to demand equal rights for women in property and custody laws, educational opportunities, and full participation in all aspects of community life. On day two, men were invited and over 40 attended, including Frederick Douglass. The Declaration of Sentiments and Grievances was adopted and signed, and 11 out of the 12 total resolutions regarding specific rights for women were passed unanimously. The 9th resolution, however, which declared, quote, it is the duty of the women of this country to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise, was the only one to meet opposition. After a lengthy debate in which Frederick Douglass sided with Stanton in arguing the importance of female enfranchisement, the resolution was finally passed. For proclaiming a woman's right to vote, the Seneca Falls Convention was subjected to public ridicule, and some backers of the women's rights movement withdrew their support. So a note about Frederick Douglass. As previously mentioned, he was one of the 40 men present on day two at the Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls. An escaped slave and a self-educated man, Douglass was an articulate, highly respected speaker and the most famous Black man of his day. His eloquent support of the controversial 9th or suffrage resolution was essential to its passage. So before we leave Seneca Falls, anybody have any questions? Okay. 3 years later, Elizabeth Cady Stanton met Quaker teacher Susan B. Anthony in Seneca Falls, and they formed an activist team dedicated to women's suffrage. And this is the more traditional picture that you've seen of the two women later in their lives. While most of us are familiar with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and in fact, for me, when I grew up, they were the only suffragists I had really heard about in my schooling. However, there were many other American women who were mobilizing nationwide for both abolition and women's suffrage. Frances E.W. Harper was a prolific writer and noted abolitionist who became one of the most active Black leaders in the equal suffrage movement in the second half of the 19th century. She gained a reputation as an accomplished orator when working for the Maine Anti-Slavery League from 1854 to 1856. She later used her oratorial skills to advocate for women's rights, racial equality, and temperance nationally. By her death in 1911, she was widely praised as a symbol of empowered and empowering womanhood. When the Civil War began, suffragists stopped most political action in order to support the war effort and the abolition of slavery. When the war ended, when the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868, its specific wording angered suffragists. So these are known as the Reconstruction Amendments. And I'm just going to kind of read what it says here. So the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868, a portion of it, it's long, but a portion of it reads, but when the right to vote at any election is denied to any of the male inhabitants of such state, being 21 years of age and citizens of the United States, ... Please note, this is the first reference to gender in the Constitution. I have to move this away so I can read this here. There we go. Now the 15th Amendment, which was ratified 2 years later in 1870, reads, a portion of it, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So in this amendment, gender is specifically omitted. So the word changes here are no accident. The word male was added to the 14th Amendment because of the women's suffrage movement. back when women's voting rights weren't even being discussed, gender-neutral terms had sufficed. On the other hand, gender was purposely left out when voting rights were guaranteed to formerly enslaved in the 15th Amendment, formerly enslaved men, in the 15th Amendment 2 years later. Oh, shoot. Sorry. Here we go. Suffragists were outraged and the movement splintered. So Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe formed the American Women Suffrage Association, or the AWSA. And I want to warn you, there's all these initials for these different organizations. It's a little hard to keep track of. But their organization supported the idea that this was the Negro's hour, as they put it, and women's time would come for suffrage. Their goal was to add women's suffrage amendments to state constitutions, state by state. On the other hand, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony formed the National Women's Suffrage Association, the NWSA, and they decided they could not support the enfranchisement of Black men without the inclusion of American women. Their goal was a new constitutional amendment enfranchising women. So it's really important to note at this juncture, Frederick Douglass publicly disagreed with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and both women said some things that I think we would find somewhat offensive today. Douglass argued that prejudice and violence against Black men made their need for the franchise more pressing. Despite this disagreement, however, Douglass's support for women's suffrage remained strong and unwavering throughout his lifetime. Questions? No? Okay, there's a lot on this slide, and I'm sorry about that. I love this image called The Awakening. But as far as the state, so we got two strategies going on: constitutional amendment on the one hand, and then the idea of state by state enfranchisement for women. So as far as the state by state strategy was concerned, progress on women's suffrage was slow, but it was steady for a while, moving geographically from west to east. And this is a little fanciful in this political cartoon or image. But you can see from the list here that in 1869, the Wyoming Territory Constitution grants women the right to vote. This was the first government in the world to guarantee women the right to vote. Now, the territorial government had hoped it would attract women. Men outnumbered women 6-1 in the state. However, unfortunately, the underlying racism in American society raised its ugly head even here. According to Rebecca Boggs Roberts, who I met, I'll tell you about her later, in a very interesting book, Suffragists in Washington, D.C., Roberts states, the Democrats in the territorial legislature worried that the newly enfranchised Blacks would vote for Republicans, and they hoped female voters would balance with Democratic votes. In fact, when Wyoming's women voted majority Republican, the Democrats in the legislature tried to repeal universal suffrage. So you can see this slide just kind of takes us through the beginning of the 20th century, kind of showing Washington Territory. We see that in 1878, the NWSA drafted a constitutional amendment, later called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. So the two parts of the movement are ultimately pursuing women's suffrage, but they're going about it with very different strategies. So as far as the constitutional amendment strategy is concerned, I already mentioned that the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, what later called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, was drafted. And it actually did not make any general statements about citizenship and the right to vote. It simply prohibited disenfranchisement on account of sex. It was voted on only once when it was defeated in the Senate in 1887. It was introduced in every single Congress after that, and unfortunately went exactly nowhere. So now, just before we go on to the next little piece, 20 years after that split that happened after the Reconstruction Amendments, the movement actually came back together, and we see that in 1890 at the urging of the younger generation of suffragists. So the daughters of some of the earlier suffragists came together in 1890. The NWSA and the AWSA merged when Harriet Stanton Blatch, who was Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter, and Alice Stone Blackwell, Lucy Stone's daughter, convinced the older generation of suffragists that the two organizations really needed to join forces again. Thus, the National American Women Suffrage Association, or the NAWSA, is formed. Okay, I'm gonna take a breath. Any questions? Anything coming up that I need to respond to?
I don't see any questions.
Okay, please do feel free, or if you have a comment, let me know. I feel bad to be just kind of lecturing, but I'll proceed unless you have other stuff. Okay, so meanwhile, so we're kind of going back a bit. In 1872, Susan B. Anthony, shown here on the left, and other women cast votes in Rochester, New York. They argued that they were citizens as defined by the 14th Amendment, and therefore had the right to vote. And they were arrested. Susan B. Anthony insisted on a trial, and actually, I love this part, she went on a lecture tour between her arrest and trial to publicize her actions and what was going on. She was found guilty in June 1873 and fined $100, which she never paid. So, on the right-hand side, we see a photograph of Sojourner Truth, and I have to mention her here. I'm going to go on a little bit about her because I just think she's absolutely amazing. Sojourner Truth was born a slave in 1797 in Ulster County, New York. The name she was given at when she was born was Isabella Baumfree. When Isabella was 9, she was sold away from her parents. Enslaved by Dutch settlers, Dutch was Isabella's first language. As you know, she grew up, she moved on. In 1826, Isabella decided to free herself along with her infant daughter. So she escaped from slavery. In 1843, Baumfree became a Methodist. She felt that she was called by God to leave the city and to testify the hope that was in her across the countryside. She changed her name to Sojourner Truth and began touring the country, speaking against slavery. By all accounts, Sojourner was a tall, strong woman with a deep voice. I've heard accounts that she's estimated to have been as much as 6 feet tall, which at that time is very tall for a woman or a man. She was an impressive figure. In May of 1851, Sojourner attended the Ohio Women's Rights Convention in Akron, where she delivered her famous speech known today as Ain't I a Woman? Though if you want to see some interesting information, you can go to the Sojourner Truth home site where they talk about that speech, and there's a great deal of debate about whether or not she actually used that phrase in her speech. Sojourner Truth could not read or write, so there are no written records of her speech. So what we have is an initial record in a newspaper written by a reporter who was there and wrote out her speech. And then we have 10 years or maybe even longer, I forget how long ago after that, another record of the speech was written, which is dramatically different and gives her a Southern accent and a Southern style of speaking, even though that is without question not the way Sojourner Truth would have spoken, based on where she was raised, where she was from. During the Civil War, Truth helped recruit African-American men for the Union Army. In 1864, she worked for the National Freedmen's Relief Association in Washington, D.C., where she met President Abraham Lincoln. While she was in Washington, she traveled on public streetcars in support of their desegregation. She was even arrested and won her subsequent case. She was an activist for desegregation almost 100 years before Claudette Colvin and Rosa Parks. I think that's just fantastic. Starting in 1870, Truth advocated to secure land grants from the federal government for formerly enslaved people, which was unfortunately unsuccessful. As part of this work, she met President Ulysses S. Grant in the White House. In 1872, she returned to Battle Creek and worked on Grant's re-election campaign. There, she boldly went to the polls on election day to vote, but she was turned away. So though Susan B. Anthony is the woman we generally hear about who broke the law and attempted to vote, it's important that we remember that she was not the only one. So just as a quick aside, take a look at this picture of Sojourner Truth and take a look at the thread on her skirt. I was watching a scholar at a completely different venue talking about this picture, and this scholar pointed out that if you notice, it's the eastern seaboard. You can see it. There's Florida down at the bottom, and you can see the Great Lakes up at the top. I just think that is a fantastic thing to notice. And I can't really give you any idea exactly how that came to be, but there it is. So anyway, something to ponder. Isn't that wonderful? So.
Hey, Anne, there is a question in the chat.
Yes.
In the early states, could women vote in every election?
In the early states that we listed on the previous slide, not always. Sometimes they were, in some cases they were granted local election privileges. So they could vote for school board, or they could, in some cases, it sort of depended state by state, which types of elections they could vote in. In some cases, like, when California finally gave women the right to vote, I think it was in 1911, that was for all elections. So it sort of depended state by state on where the women were enabled to vote.
And then there's a new question. How did someone become free before abolition?
You mean in terms of Sojourner Truth? Well, she's an interesting case because she was in New York, and New York had a clause that indicated that by such and such a date, slaves would be freed who had been enslaved prior to a certain date. And so Sojourner Truth's owner at the time promised that he would release her prior to that date, and then he reneged on the deal, and so she just said, "I'm out of here." So she was an escaped slave, but she was living in a state that ultimately the slavery did not exist, at least formally. But she did travel as a person, a formerly enslaved person. She traveled to places like Washington, D.C., where there were still, places in close to the South, or actually part of the South, where slavery still existed. So she kind of walked that line. That's a really good question. This is such an interesting story about her. I hope that answers that question. Okay, so now we've taken a look at her skirt. Next slide. So now I bring you Ida B. Wells. I love this picture of Ida B. With her children. Meanwhile, Black suffragists continued to voice their right to an equal role in the women's suffrage campaign, and Ida B. Wells must be mentioned. Ida B. Wells is known for her active work toward anti-lynching legislation, but she was so complex. She was a truly courageous journalist and a respected leader in the Black community. And she was also a staunch suffragist who refused to be ignored by the white-dominated movement. In 1884, when she was 22, she refused to move to the colored section on a train and was forcibly removed. She successfully sued the railroad, and she was successful in her suit, but the case was reversed on appeal. Ida B. Wells was more outspoken than most of her contemporaries, and she publicly, on several occasions, admonished white suffrage leaders for supporting racial segregation out of expediency for women's rights. So she's important to mention, and she does come up in our story again. Oops, come on. This is Mary Church Terrell. I have to work on pronouncing her name correctly. She was another star of the growing African-American women's suffrage movement. The two largest African-American associations, the National Federation of Afro-American Women and the National League of Colored Women, voted to merge in 1896. The new National Association of Colored Women elected 33-year-old Mary Church Terrell as its first president and adopted the motto, "Lifting as we climb." With the resolve and skills of a diplomat, Terrell repeatedly challenged white suffragists to not abandon their Black sisters, addressing the NAWSA convention in 1898. Any questions about, I'm hoping that some of these suffragists are people you have not met before. And I'm hoping that maybe my brief introduction of them will cause you to want to go out and do some more reading about them. Each one is unique and interesting and worth knowing more about. And I feel sad that it's only been in the last, I mean, I've been learning a lot, but only in the last 5-6 years that I've been learning about these fantastic people. So at this point, we need to cross the Atlantic for a minute and talk about Emmeline Pankhurst. Though I have focused so far on the US suffrage movement, and I will, because that's what our topic is, this story cannot be told without including the very influential and inspiring British suffrage powerhouse, Emmeline Pankhurst, pictured here in both of these pictures. The Pankhurst women, Emmeline and her daughters, Christabel and Sylvia, were leaders of a militant faction of suffragettes in England, and they called them, they're the ones who welcomed the term suffragette and embraced it, whose motto was deeds, not words. Believing that prayer, petitions, and patience were not enough to successfully enfranchise women, the Pankhursts engaged in direct and visible actions, such as heckling, window smashing, rock throwing, to raise public awareness about the suffrage issue. Emmeline herself was even arrested for slapping the police commissioner. These women were bold, and their goal was to get notice, to get pictures taken, for people to see them and not be able to ignore them. Their notoriety gained them front page coverage on many London newspapers, where they were seen being carried away in handcuffs by the police. The Pankhursts also devised a political strategy to hold the party in power responsible, regardless of affiliation, for women's secondary status. So they decided that they wanted to act directly to the politicians and hold them responsible for what they see as inaction. Many Americans who visited England during the first decade of the 20th century brought back news and inspiration based on the bold actions of the Pankhursts. These American women included Alice Paul, Lucy Burns, Harriet Stanton Blatch, and Inez Milholland. Oops, sorry. Emmeline herself visited the United States 4 times between 1909 and 1915, and Christabel and Sylvia toured the US several times as well. Both of these pictures are on one of Emmeline's tours. I think the one on the right, I know she spoke to a packed house at Carnegie Hall. I'm not certain if this is a picture of Carnegie Hall. I was having a hard time. Oh, it says it at the bottom. Okay, so this is Carnegie Hall. Another picture I saw looked a little bit different. So this is Emmeline speaking to a packed house at Carnegie Hall. Questions about Emmeline Pankhurst? Isn't she amazing? She's really, really worth looking into, and she'll come up in our story again. But you have
There's a comment in the chat that says that in the 2015 movie, The Suffragette, Meryl Streep starred as Emmeline.
You know what? I haven't seen that.
So there you go.
Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. Okay, one to write down on my list.
And then Jane put a note in here about the PBS vote program, and she said that there's a discussion of how the white and black groups work together, and she was just wondering if anybody, that's how she recalls it, and wondered if that's correct.
You mean in the PBS?
The PBS show.
I mean, they worked together. They had, they did come together. Then there were falling outs. The worst, I mean, what we see is that because the South was so resistant to having African Americans vote, period. On the one hand, and we'll see it coming up a little bit later, the suffragists kind of avoided southern states that were trying to go state by state. They kind of avoided southern states, trying to go to the places where they thought they would have the best way to be successful. there were sometimes tactics used, and it gets confusing because there are so many different factions moving, and I'm really open to if somebody knows more than I, please speak up. But there were instances where suffragists used tactics of, if we give women the right to vote in the South, that will help them outvote Black males. But I'm not saying that exactly right. So yes, they did work together. And yes, they did work in opposition, because racism was still so prevalent, and racism was inspiring so much in the South in terms of Jim Crow coming into existence, separate but equal, separate but not equal. Anybody out in the audience or anybody in the listening group want to add into that? Molly Kate, if you're there, if you want to add a little something, I'd be grateful to you, because I know you're real knowledgeable about this.
Everything you're saying sounds just right to me.
You are so sweet. Okay. So am I right?
I wanted to make a point. I recall that they wanted that the Black groups ultimately decided to put their interests secondary in order to get the right to vote for women in the North, because they realized that the Southerners were so afraid of Black women having the right to vote that if they put their interests secondary to that maybe the whole women's suffrage vote would go through. That's kind of the impression I got from the movie. Am I off base?
I mean, I would say that is true with some, I would say that.
But not all. Yeah.
Not all, yeah. And certainly I would think that Ida B. Wells was not one to be in agreement with that. There's kind of a feeling of we need solidarity. But then how do you, that's always how do you go about reaching your goals, put the goal ahead of the ultimate goal ahead of individual rights, or do you continue to fight what's wrong, what is wrong, and stick together? So that's how I would interpret it. And again, the story is twists and turns, and there are many different activists. So I would be hesitant to say it was a unified effort. Anybody else have a comment about that, has more knowledge? I do recommend watching that show, The Vote. It is fantastic, and maybe you'll watch it and realize that Jane has remembered it better than I have. Okay.
It's unlikely.
Don't go there. I've been doing a lot of reading and going around. There's just so much, and so many new people to meet. Okay, so I'm gonna move on. This photograph features two prominent activists, one of whom I've already mentioned, Harriet Stanton Blatch and Rose Schneiderman. So Harriet Stanton Blatch was the daughter of pioneering suffragist Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She lived in England for 20 years, and after returning home to the US, she sought to broaden support for women's suffrage movement by joining with the leadership of the Women's Trade Union League. She founded the Equality League of Self-Supporting Women in New York City in 1906 to, quote, bring to suffrage the strength of women engaged in wage-earning occupations, as well as continuing to collaborate with prominent society women. The core membership of the Equality League consisted of working class women who played a large role in marching in the suffrage parade of 1910 that Blatch was instrumental in organizing. I'll show you a picture of that in just a second. Blatch and her organization were also largely responsible for the continuous campaign in New York, which ultimately led to women's suffrage being granted there in 1917. Also pictured here is Rose Schneiderman. Rose was a Russian Jewish immigrant and prominent garment union activist who participated in the uprising of 20,000 shirtwaist workers that led to the International Ladies Garment Workers Union in 1909. Later, Rose would become the president of the National Women's Trade Union League. for Rose Schneiderman, suffrage was the means of acquiring economic rights. So I think it's interesting to bring in, now we have women in garment industry, in factories in the North, also seeing suffrage as a means to not only achieve rights, but also to be able to have workplace rights and be able to vote on those. So this is, I love this. This is the page from the New York Times, May 29th, 1910. And this is about the Women's Suffrage Parade in New York on Saturday, May 21st, 1910. So as a, quote, protest against the legislature for its indifference to our demands for women's suffrage, Harriet Stanton Blatch and the Equality League of Self-Supporting Women organized the first major women suffrage parade in New York City in 1910. Over 400 women marched in a tight column down Fifth Avenue past several thousand curious onlookers to a mass meeting in Union Square. And I love this picture of Anna Shaw. She's kind of right in the middle with her mortarboard on, who was older, and initially they were concerned that she wouldn't want to be a participant, but come to find out, Anna Shaw loved a parade, and she was thrilled to be a participant in that event. Okay, now enter Alice Paul, and I'll tell you unabashedly that Alice Paul is my favorite. Initially, this slideshow was almost exclusively about Alice Paul, and then I thought, that's wrong. I need to expand it out. But I am here to say that as a teenager, when I learned about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, I thought they were brave and interesting, but they seemed old and kind of boring. Had I learned about Alice Paul, however, I think I would have become a much bigger enthusiast for the suffrage movement as a teenager, as a young woman, because of her amazing style and youthful fervor. So this is Alice Paul. She was born in 1885 to a Quaker family in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. And Alice attended Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania and graduated with a degree in biology in 1905. Okay, this is pretty unusual in and of itself. At the age of 22, Alice left for Birmingham, England, to study social work at the Woodbrook Settlement. One day, she passed a crowd jeering a female speaker, and she stopped to observe the chaos. Alice introduced herself to the speaker later, and the speaker turned out to be Christabel Pankhurst, daughter of England's most radical suffragette, Emmeline Pankhurst, who we saw earlier. So Paul was immediately taken up, and even wrote to her mother that she had taken up with the suffragettes, and she joined their movement, personally, supposedly, according to an interview, breaking more than 48 windows, and she was arrested and imprisoned on several occasions. In the summer of 1909, Alice was arrested along with 111 other suffragettes. In jail, she was arrested and jailed. In jail, she declared herself a political prisoner and went on a hunger strike. She was not the only one, but Alice went on a hunger strike, and as a result, Alice was force-fed twice daily, a total of 55 times during her 30 days in jail. A later slide will show you a little bit about what that process looks like. Pretty horrific. Alice's health deteriorated rapidly, and she had to return to the United States. However, before that, in England, Paul also met another American, Lucy Burns. She met Lucy in a British police station, and the two discussed their dream of a federal women's suffrage amendment back home. So in 1910, when Alice returned home after she was released and recovering from her illness and injuries, she returned home where suffragists were largely pursuing the vote with the state-by-state campaign that we talked about. Between 1910 and 1912, Washington, California, Oregon, Kansas, and Arizona had granted women the right to vote. And you can remember that picture we saw and the little timeline. And Alice was looking for the right role for herself in the American suffrage movement. She finished her PhD, gave lectures, and advised on several campaigns and events. Her dream of a constitutional amendment languished. However, when Lucy Burns moved back to the United States from England in 1912, Alice Paul finally had a partner with similar goals and sentiments. The two decided it was time to make their suffrage dream a reality by pursuing a constitutional amendment, something Susan B. Anthony had championed unsuccessfully. Together, they sought public, splashy ways to bring their cause to the forefront, based on what they had learned in England from the Pankhursts. For Paul and Burns, the state-by-state approach was too slow, too boring, and way too polite. Reviving the goal of a constitutional amendment was much more immediate and bold. They determined that a move to Washington, D.C. would bring them closer to decision makers at the national level and give them a better, more visible stage for their public advocacy. And they formed what they called the Congressional Committee. Oops. It was the vision of Alice Paul and Lucy Burns to stage a massive, splashy parade in Washington, D.C. They decided, before I go on to this, tell you about this. A year ago, a little less than a year ago, I was in Washington, D.C. at a history conference, and I signed up for a little junket to walk this parade route in Washington, D.C. And I met the woman I referred to earlier. What is her name? Here she is. Rebecca Boggs Roberts, turns out to actually be Cokie Roberts' daughter. And she led us on the walk through Washington, D.C. And I got so inspired by this parade that I had never really known anything about. I bought her book, read it, and so I'm going to tell you about this parade because it fascinates me. So Alice and Lucy decided that the date of March 3rd, 1913 would be perfect. It was the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration for his first term as the 28th President of the United States. The plan was to march straight down Pennsylvania Avenue from the Capitol to the White House, and then continue one more block to what is now Constitution Hall for a celebration and a rally. Initially, the police superintendent balked in granting them a permit. However, Alice Paul was intent on the parade following the same route where men had marched and important national celebrations had taken place in the past. Eventually, the permit was granted. Alice Paul could be very persuasive, and planning for the massive parade began. The plan for the parade included, I love that, I don't know how much of the details you can see, but this is the plan for the parade. So it included 7 sections of marchers, floats with representatives from the few nations with full suffrage: New Zealand, Australia, Finland, and Norway. Professional women would march in thematic dress organized by occupation. And you can see in the picture, you see lawyers, nurses, librarians, state delegations. College women would be grouped by alma mater. There'd be golden chariots. There'd be women's marching bands, on, as you can see. And the program, which you saw on the previous slide, we march today to give evidence to the world of our determination that this simple act of justice shall be done. So, Alice Paul immediately began recruiting suffragists from around the country to participate in this big parade. In New York City, activist Rosalie Gardner Jones, and she's the person in the far left with the big cloak on, proposed a Votes for Women pilgrimage from New York City to Washington, D.C. to publicize the parade and appealed to newly elected Woodrow Wilson to support a federal amendment. The pilgrimage began on February 12th, 1913. Oh, by the way, the pilgrimage, they're walking. I guess I didn't say that. So they're walking from New York to Washington, D.C. in February. So it began on February 12th, 1913, with the marchers finally arriving in Washington, D.C. on February 28th. The pilgrims walked 295 miles in 16 very wintry days. They were met at their final destination with cheers and a mounted honor guard, all sent by Alice Paul's congressional committee. And along the way, there was a ton of publicity. There were lots of reporters reporting back. It was a splash of publicity, and many fell in love with General Rosalie Gardner Jones. And you can't help it. There's a lot of great pictures of her. She's wonderful. So March 3rd, 1913, dawned bright, clear, and cold. Jane Burleson, a notable socialite, artist, and Texas suffragist, was the grand marshal of the parade and led the procession with her attendants on horseback and on foot. She was followed by Inez Milholland as the first of 4 mounted heralds. Inez Milholland Boussavain, I think I'm pronouncing that right. She deserves a little extra shout out here. She was a suffragist, a labor lawyer, socialist, World War I correspondent, and a public speaker who greatly influenced the women's movement in America. In her short life, she dedicated herself to social reform on many levels. She joined organizations striving to improve the working conditions of children and the lives of African Americans. She was also a strong supporter of shirtwaist and laundry workers. And just as a tragic side note, 3 years after this picture and after the 1913 parade, Inez collapsed and died at the age of 30 during a Western suffrage lecture tour. She died for the cause, tragically. She's a very impressive woman, in my opinion. So behind Inez followed a wagon with a massive sign called the Great Demand Banner. It read, you can read it there, but it read, "We demand an amendment to the Constitution of the United States, enfranchising the women of this country." The making of a public demand was a new, bold strategy, something nice women didn't do. And it was definitely modeled after the Pankhursts and their approach in England.
And what was Inez's last name?
It was Boussavain, so her Milholland. So her, I think probably her maiden name was Milholland, and her last name was Boissevain. Yeah. And she's someone I had not heard of before, but she, when you read it, she kind of went on that whistle-stop tour around the country advocating for women's suffrage and for the suffrage amendment, and became ill and died while on that trip. Okay, so this is the public, oh yeah, so the Pankhursts. Moving on to the next one. And were there other questions? Okay, here we go. Okay, the procession began late, but went well for the first few blocks. Everything was designed to be visually striking and look great in photographs in newspapers around the country. Alice had planned it to a T. There was even going to be an allegorical tableau on the Treasury steps, which was several blocks down the parade route. And it was similarly well designed. Dozens of women and girls in classical costumes created scenes meant to represent Columbia, summoning justice, charity, liberty, peace, plenty, and hope to the stirring sounds of the Star-Spangled Banner and the triumphal march from Aida. And you can't really tell here, but for the most part, they were barefoot. And I want you to keep thinking, this is winter in Washington, D.C. And so this was the plan. There were, apparently there were some risers, some grounds that people could sit and watch the tableau, watch the parade go by and watch the tableau as well. And the idea was that when the parade reached the tableau, they would stop. The tableau would, the actors and actresses would do their thing, play the music, do the show, and then they would join in at the end of the parade and meet up at the rally at the end. It didn't quite go that way, however. So soon after the start of the parade, the crowds, mostly men in town for the following day's presidential inauguration, and many of whom were drunk, surged into the street, making it impossible for the marchers to pass other than in single file. Here you can barely see them. Some places toward the front, it was really bad. They were able to come in and, well, I think I'll get to that. Yeah. So the marchers began to feel increasingly threatened as their space is being crowded, they're being jeered at, they're being things thrown at them. Burleson and Milholland fought their way through the crowd. Remember, they were on horseback, so that's a little bit easier. But the going was very slow, and the crowd became increasingly hostile. They arrived over an hour late at the tableau, where the barefoot performers were freezing. Behind them, because of support from horseback troops from Fort Myer, who'd kind of been ready if needed to step in, the later sections of the parade had a bit more room, but no more support from the crowd. They were jeered, grabbed, spat upon, shouted at, and tripped. There were police officers along the line, but often they turned their backs, participated in the jeering, and they did not move to support the marchers as they were coming through. Inevitably, injuries occurred. 2 ambulances, and you can see one there in the picture on the left, came and went constantly for hours, always impeded and sometimes even stopped, so that the driver and the doctor had to fight their way to the injured. At least 100 people were taken to the local hospital. Believe it or not, most of the marchers eventually made their way to the final rally site, but it could not be described as a victory celebration at the end of a glorious day. And in the words of Rebecca Boggs Roberts, she said, "Every woman in the hall was some combination of filthy, battered, exhausted, unnerved, insulted, weepy, furious, and freezing." Though the press coverage was vastly different than what Alice Paul had anticipated, the parade photographs and headlines shocked the nation. People back home were horrified to see their mothers, grandmothers, daughters, and granddaughters being so badly treated. The public outcry and its accompanying press coverage proved a windfall for the suffragists. Headlines around the nation in the days following the parade included this one, which says, "Parade struggles to victory despite disgraceful scenes." Other headlines included, "Nation aroused by open insults to women," and "Capital mobs made converts to suffrage." So, anybody have any comments or questions about the big parade, 1913? Okay. The 1913 Women's Suffrage Parade is sometimes called the first peaceful march on Washington. Peaceful somewhat, I guess, the first peaceful march. However, even within the organization of the march, the nation's underlying problem of racism and segregation raised its specter. Ida B. Wells was justifiably outraged by the organizers' demand that Black women march in the back. Not to be deterred, once the parade began and amidst the ensuing chaos that we've just talked about, she slipped in quietly and defiantly with her Illinois delegation. And in the accounts of how this all came down, Alice Paul was very conflicted about this because Alice Paul was a Quaker, and Alice Paul did believe in, had a much more egalitarian feeling about rights for all people. But she didn't want the parade to get derailed. She had suffragists from the South. There was a lot of controversy about this. And in the end, they decided that the African-American contingencies could be at the back, and they didn't do a lot of advertising of that. And needless to say, that wasn't okay with Ida B. And she argued about it and then slipped away. And then once the parade began, she slipped in with the Illinois delegation. You got to admire Ida B. Wells. A lesser known figure in the march was Marie Louise Bottineau Baldwin. She was a North Dakota Turtle Mountain Chippewa native. She was educated in Minnesota schools and later attended St. John's Ladies College in Canada. President Theodore Roosevelt appointed her as a clerk to the Office of Indian Affairs, the first Native American to hold a federal position. Baldwin embraced her Native identity and wore her tribal dress and braids for her federal employee identification photo. In 1911, Baldwin became a key spokesperson for Native women. She was a strong advocate also for women's suffrage. She participated in the 1913 suffrage parade, and in 1914 was among other key suffragists who met with President Wilson to encourage him to support women's right to vote. So now we move to events after the parade, following 1913. Carrie Chapman Catt reluctantly assumed a second term as the NAWSA president in December 1915, after years of suffrage work internationally and in New York. She declared the American movement in crisis and at a crossroads, as suggested by by a newsletter. Her winning plan, unveiled in 1916, called for a campaign to secure women's suffrage in at least 36 states, enough to ratify a federal amendment. Women able to vote in those states would then pressure their elected representatives and senators to pass a constitutional amendment. So she came out with what she considered to be her winning plan. In this way, she urged avoiding detours, and this is what we talked about earlier, into states considered hopeless, namely much of the South, while funding more promising state campaigns, lobbying for a federal amendment, and building support for future ratification efforts. Oh, shoot, that went the wrong way. There we go. While NAWSA and Carrie Chapman Catt endorsed President Wilson and looked to members of the Democratic Party as allies, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns wanted to hold Wilson and his party responsible for women's continued disenfranchisement. Again, a tactic used by the British suffragettes. In 1914, Paul and Burns severed all ties with NAWSA and formed the National Women's Party, or the NWP. See how these initials are getting progressively confusing and overlapped. The NWP organized what were called the Silent Sentinels, pictured here, to stand outside the White House holding banners inscribed, in some cases with incendiary phrases directed at President Wilson. This had never been done before. The president initially treated the picketers with bemused condescension, tipping his hat to them as he passed by. However, his attitude changed when the US entered World War I in 1917. Few believed that suffragists would dare to picket a wartime president, but let alone use the war in their messages. When the picket signs dared to address to the president as Kaiser Wilson, drawing uncomfortable parallels to the enemy German leader, many people saw the suffragist wartime protests as unpatriotic, and the Sentinels, including Alice Paul, were attacked by angry mobs. When they wouldn't go away, the picketers began to be arrested on the charge of obstructing traffic on the sidewalk and were jailed when they refused to pay the imposed fines. Despite the danger of bodily harm and imprisonment, the suffragists continued their demonstrations, often going directly back to the picket line immediately after being released from jail. The sentences got longer, a few days, to 2 weeks, to a month, 2 months. As a repeat offender, Alice Paul was given a sentence of 7 months. Eventually, most of the sentenced suffragists went to Occoquan Workhouse, a prison complex in Virginia. The women's workhouse on the complex had been built in 1912, largely for women convicted of prostitution, vagrancy, and public drunkenness. There, Alice Paul and other suffragists demanded to be treated as political prisoners, and they staged hunger strikes. So in these pictures, you see, them being arrested. The picture with the broken windows, that was one of the things the suffragists did, was they broke out the windows of the workhouse where they were imprisoned. So there, Paul and other suffragists demanded to be treated as political prisoners and staged hunger strikes, as I said. Their demands were met with brutality, as suffragists, including frail older women, were beaten, pushed, and thrown into cold, unsanitary, rat-infested cells. For staging hunger strikes, Paul and others were forcibly fed in a torturous manner. And that's what you see in that photograph on the right, with a woman. You see the man on the left pouring fluids. I think it was eggs and milk, I believe is what that was, through a tube that went down either through her nose or her throat directly into her stomach. According to Paul and others who endured it, it was excruciatingly horrible. And remember, this for Paul is the second time she's been through this exact same ordeal. By the way, there is the movie Iron-Jawed Angels, which is worth seeing, that talks about this and other aspects of the suffrage movement. Well, news of the prison conditions and when news of the prison conditions and hunger strikes became known, the press, some politicians, and the public began demanding the women's release. Sympathy for the prisoners brought many to support the cause of women's suffrage. And when the women were released from the workhouse, there were reporters there to show the terrible condition that they were in. And the public was appalled. In 1917, in response to public outcry about the prison abuse, President Wilson reversed his position and announced his support for a suffrage amendment. It should be noted here that throughout this time,
Anne, are you there?
I think we lost her.
Yeah, she's definitely frozen. Let's see, Anne, can you hear me? I think she's probably going to rejoin. She probably lost her connection. Let's give her a minute.
Isn't it amazing how, as much progress as we've made, we're still fighting like this? I mean, on some,
and pressing hard in more traditional ways, but by also with supporting the war effort, kind of distancing herself from what she saw as these kind of potentially traitorous looking behaviors of the silent sentinels out in front of the White House. So let me see, where am I in my slides? Okay, we were there at Occoquan. Okay, so also it's important to know that Harriet Stanton Blatch was similarly hard at work in New York, lobbying legislators and business leaders there to pass the statewide suffrage legislation, I think in 1917. So I really feel it's important that we realize that there were, on numerous fronts, the suffrage cause was being pushed. And really, one can't help but feel that the combination of all these efforts are what eventually led to the amendment, or the amendment being passed and women getting the right to vote. So let me go on. I'm kind of floundering here, sorry. Okay, so in 1919, both the House and the Senate passed the 19th Amendment, and the battle for state-by-state ratification began. The final ratification state came down to Tennessee in the summer of 1920. If a majority of the state legislature voted for the amendment, it would become the law of the land. The deciding vote was cast by 24-year-old Harry Byrne, the youngest member of the Tennessee Assembly. Originally intending to vote no, Byrne changed his vote after receiving a telegram from his mother asking him to support women's suffrage. On August 18th, 1920, Tennessee ratified the 19th Amendment. 6 days later, Secretary of State Colby certified the ratification, and with the stroke of the pen, American women gained the right to vote after a 42-year battle. August 26th is now celebrated as Women's Equality Day in the US. Here, Carrie Chapman Catt receives congratulations on the ratification. Just a little side note, FYI, 6 months earlier, anticipating the passage of the amendment, Catt and the NAWSA officially founded the League of Women Voters. And so that's just a little side note that Carrie went on to found that, knowing that the vote was going to be finally approved. And here's Alice Paul unfurling her suffrage banner, which she had sewed state by state as states ratified the amendment. And this is in front of I believe this is in front of what's now called Alice Paul House in Washington, DC. I'm pretty sure that is the case. And here's Alice, possibly a picture you've seen before, raising a glass, supposedly of juice, grape juice, to the ratification of the 19th Amendment. So here's the question that I promised we would talk about a little bit, and then I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. What's my time like? Oh, we're getting close to the end. So here's the question. Did the 19th Amendment grant the vote to all women? Well, not exactly. Before 1920, we have to remember, 15 states, mainly in the West, had already had full female suffrage, while others had granted women partial voting rights, which is what we talked about earlier. And after the amendment, which declared only that states could not discriminate in voting based on sex, millions of women of color were still barred from the polls. Most African-American women in the South, like African-American men, were blocked by poll taxes, literacy tests, and other racial barriers at the state level. Additionally, Native Americans and Asian immigrants were largely excluded from citizenship entirely. Native American women and men were only considered citizens, were not considered citizens, and therefore they were denied suffrage until 1924. So I read that wrong. So they were not considered citizens until 1924 with the passage of the Indian Citizenship Act, in which case they got the right to vote. So that was Native American women and men. Asian immigrants were ineligible for citizenship under the Chinese Exclusion Act. This act was repealed in 1943. And finally, there's the case of Puerto Rico, which as a territory was not covered by the 19th Amendment. Its government remained free to discriminate on the basis of sex, which it did, waiting until 1929 to enfranchise literate women, and until 1935 for all women. So a quote, it's important to remember how piecemeal a struggle it was. This is from Robin Muncie, a historian at the University of Maryland and one of the curators of the National Archives. Seeing change as coming in one fell swoop undermines us as citizens and gives us a false idea about the way change happens. So that concludes what I had prepared. Does anybody want to add some insights or ideas?
Before we do that, I do have a couple questions.
Okay, let's see.
So, was there a connection between the suffragette movement and the temperance movement and later emergence of the National Organization of Women?
The later of national. So, well, I'll tell you what I know, what I remember. Yes, in fact, this is kind of when I didn't even talk about it, but there were connections with the women's movement and temperance for sure. And one of the things that made the path or the women's suffrage, what had people objecting to women's suffrage, came from business interests, especially the liquor lobby, fearing that if women got the right to vote, they would influence the temperance, and that they would, same thing with labor. They were afraid that if women got the right to vote, they would vote, in favor of temperance and also in favor of labor unions. So part of the opposition to women's suffrage came from liquor lobbies and owners of large factory workers fearing that women would step in for those kinds of reforms. Now, we didn't even talk, I want to say one thing that real fast, just so you know, Alice Paul, get this, she lived till 1977. Amazing to me. And she wrote the Equal Rights Amendment. It is, and she first proposed it. She went on, she did, let's see, I have this info. So, she wrote the Equal Rights Amendment in 1923, and the amendment called for absolute equality, stating men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States in every place subject to its jurisdiction. And it was introduced in every session of Congress from 1923 until it passed in 1972. And that, we're in the place where we passed the deadline for ratification by states. Enough states have now ratified, and it's a question of whether the Senate will approve a change in that deadline so that it can actually become law of the land, which is super interesting. And there may be others out there in the group that have more knowledge about that. Now, the National Organization for Women, I don't have any information about that. That might be worth looking up. My gut feeling is that National Organization of Women they mobilized more in the 1970s, but does anybody know? I don't know the answer to that.
It was founded by Gloria Steinem, and that was the 70s.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, that it was Gloria Steinem. And and you don't see any connection between that with
No, I think they were more interested in cultural change than in voting, things like that.
Yeah, that's what I remember too. And that's another woman well worth a whole PowerPoint.
You said it both ways one time. Each national organization for women, men are allowed to join as well. So the for is important, not of, because when men can join it as well, and some have in the founding, that time period. I don't know a lot of details anymore either, but yeah, they've been working on a lot of different fronts that you can't get at through just the voting rights thing.
That's for sure. Thank you, Molly.
Yeah.
Anybody else questions or?
There's a couple other just comments in general. Thank yous, but there is one question. Do you know if there is a biography available about Alice Paul?
I'm sure there is.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, I'm sure there is. I don't know that I have it, but I would bet there is. And I do recommend, I did have another, I'll show you the last slide. This book Rebecca Boggs Roberts is the person that I met and took me on this tour in Washington, D.C. last year. And it's a great book. It's filled with fantastic pictures, and it has a lot of good stuff about Alice Paul. But I really would like to know a whole lot more about Alice Paul after 1920. I mean, I know that she wrote the Equal Rights Amendment, but I would love to know what other things she was involved in. I feel bad that I didn't meet her. I mean, I was alive. I was an adult when she was still alive, and how I wish I could have met her or known more about her then. I mean, she's a real hero as far as I'm concerned. So are there any other comments or?
I wanted to, go ahead, Jane.
I wanted to point out that there's a great PBS show about Gloria Steinem that goes through her whole history and how she evolved in her struggles, emotionally and otherwise, as she went through. So I don't recall the exact name of it. I think it's a play, actually.
Really?
But you might check it out on PBS and see if you can find it. I just jumped on it partway through one night several months ago. But the whole concept that movements and changes, major societal changes occur over time, and they go backwards and then make steps forward is epitomized in civil rights. It's epitomized with the ERA. It's in so many different areas. And we should learn from that because we should be happy with each step we make. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg's efforts from a legal perspective as she made changes in the laws that allowed equal rights to move forward is a fascinating story. And there's a great, I'm sure everybody's seen that program. If they haven't, her strategy was fascinating, that she gave us the legal foundation for our current rights.
Yeah.
Lori Toomis has a question. Lori, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So I'm wondering, the percentage of women who they themselves were against the right to vote, I guess, like culturally, they felt it was inappropriate. But did their numbers percentage present a significant obstacle in itself?
I don't really know in terms of that. I mean, that's a great question. And certainly some of the research, you can see there are lots of photographs of women out there, forming organizations saying, we don't need the right to vote. This isn't something that we want. We object. I don't know their numbers in terms of how significant that was. Does anybody have that insight? That's a great question.
Just a general sense that was something that opposition from women eroded over time, as we saw with the civil rights movement, as far as white people were, their awareness and their support changed over time. So I don't have numbers either, but my sense of it from the reading I've done is that it was maybe 50-50 or something at the beginning even, but it changed over the decades as this just became something that people got used to as an idea that women are people too. But I don't have numbers either.
And also seeing the abuse and saying, oh, good grief, enough is enough, I think.
Thank you for saying that. Just be the 1913 parade of debacle, which was not Alice Paula debacle. It was exactly what she needed. Was just like when I was a child, watching people in southern cities get blown over by fire hoses and attacked by dogs for just wanting the right to vote that I thought they had already secured 100 years before. That shocked a lot of people like myself who were being pretty complacently white for a long time. And that galvanized a whole bunch of folks into the civil rights cause. And I think it was a very similar situation. Social movements often rely on shocks like that.
Well, don't you think the parallels with Malcolm X and Martin Luther King fit in so well here? Two very different strategies, both essential for making this critical change. Yeah, and I can't help but feel that with Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paula. You just feel it.
Another good parallel. Thank you. Yes.
Do we have any other questions? Because we've hit 1:30.
Okay. Well, I just want to say thank you all, those of you who stayed with us. I really appreciate your interest in history, and I wish we were having a big celebration on the 18th here locally. That was something we had hoped to do, but there will be a celebration as soon as we can have such a thing. Just because we're missing the exact date doesn't mean we're not going to celebrate. It's important.
And Anne, we want to thank you ever so much for putting this wonderful presentation together, because it was really superb. And you didn't get very many questions because you did such a superb job. So
it's my pleasure. It was super fun.